bonsai inspired by nature. First thing I think we need to ask ourselves is there even such a thing as a bonsai that's not inspired by nature? Well, I guess if you look on Facebook Marketplace, you'll find many, but we're not going to worry about them tonight. We're going to look, however, at a few things that let me get rid of that. We're going to have a look at a few things that have inspired me over the past couple of months, and in particular, the way we respond to nature and how that translates into an expression of art or an expression of something. So obviously, because this is nature, I'm going to have to show you some pretty pictures. Otherwise, this is going to be a terribly boring presentation. But trees evoke, or nature and trees specifically evoke an emotion. So the first thing we have to decide or assert is that inspiration is an emotional response, and often to places or to people or to events. So there's this connection between what we see, what we experience, and the way we respond. And ultimately, all these responses build this image in our heads of a tree that we refer to either subconsciously or consciously, but we build a reference library, if you like. And some of these trees in our head can be quite spectacular or reasonably bizarre. What stops you in the bush and makes you look builds that memory, and that emotional memory drives our response. I think Cindy once described this as a tree resonating with us. Now, obviously, most of the time when we see a tree that inspires us, our first response is to somehow replicate it. I mean, duplication is impossible since it's large, and we need to reduce it to fit into a pot. But replication is probably our next best thing. However, emulation is probably better, because what you're trying to do is capture the essence of the tree. You're not trying to make a miniature. You're trying to capture the soul. And John Knocker in his books actually encourages this. So I refer to John Knocker from time to time, not because he's better or anything, but pretty much because he wrote the book on bonsai, and he's driven our response ever since. So when we look at nature, there's obviously trigger points that kick off this emotional thing, and so we can't capture the entire scene, but what we do is we kind of isolate one element, and we try and translate that ultimately into a bonsai pot. So finding those trigger points and emphasizing them is really at the core of a nature-inspired bonsai. What I'm going to do now is just have a quick look at another aspect of this whole thing that we're not going to come back to, but we'll just have a look at it now, and that is seasonal changes. Same scene, different season, and we may have a different response. Something else might stand out. Again, season changes, our response might be different. So this memory bank of reference trees keeps growing even from a single location. There you go. Another view on the same scene. All these are drivers in our kind of chain of response. Here's something I think you may remember. Carl posted a picture on WhatsApp and asked the question, what do people make of this trident maple? I think you may remember it. And what was interesting to me was not the tree itself, although I like it. What I found most interesting was the response that this elicited. Now, if you recall, and I did a screen capture for fun, everybody, and I think this might be an Oyama thing, but everybody went to how great this tree is and started describing an experience. No one reached for the good old bonsai score sheet. There was no talk of, oh, I can't see the nabari, the trunk is obscured, branches are crossing, there's no gaps in the canopy for birds to fly through. None of that. What we saw instead was people smiling. We saw, we heard stories of, the trials and tribulations and storms, and then also placid lakes, all wrapped up in the same little tree. And that I found absolutely fascinating. And I think Sean wrapped it up nicely. He said, so I guess if it tells me that story, then it's a brilliant tree. So that essentially is the crux of this presentation. But if we take a tree, take bonsai to another extreme perhaps, how do you think these stack up? Have they been so removed from nature that they no longer speak, or is there some value in the story that they tell? What I think has happened is that we can strip the tree of all its surrounding, and we can essentially, and this is what's happened in certain parts of the art, but it doesn't negate the art. It doesn't negate that essence of the tree. If by adding features again, like little accent plants and perhaps scrolls and the like, we are recreating the context, and perhaps even have the ability to change the story by what it's surrounded with. So there's an amazing connection back to nature, even in a very highly sophisticated tree. So one other aspect, taken this bit further, is the cultural aesthetic. What we may, from our perspective, deem to be a representation of nature, might to others not. In a Japanese context, a tree might look very different, for instance, to a European one. And this is a very kind of a Walter Paul type tree. But we then also have the Vietnamese type tree. And, who's to say that this is not a bonsai? Who's to say that this doesn't represent in some way something that's not a bunch of hamburgers in space? But it tells a story. We might not relate to it, well, not immediately, unless we understand the context. But there is something inherent in a bonsai that tells a story that reaches back to its origins in nature. Matsuka Kimura created this tree, or this sculpture, and the first thing we need to ask is this a rock that looks like a tree, or is it a tree that looks like a rock? Now, I think it's difficult to kind of come to grips with this until we realize where his motivation came from, where his inspiration came from, because we don't have the same exposure he does. Not until we see what inspired him, and then it all falls into place. Another one of his creations is this, a little forest. Now, the interesting thing is that he is not showing us a tree. This is a clump of trees, with short trees both in the front and the back. So although there is a kind of a main tree, I think, in this forest, it's not the primary focus. So what is? Well, I think the focus here is actually something we don't see, something which he's alluding to, and that is the two slopes, mountain slopes. So he's actually showing us an entire mountain scene by suggesting to us something which is not on the table. So let's hear what he says.
これはどういうことをこう
これはね、どこからこの発想が来たのか分かりませんけれども、はい、私でもどこから来たのか、考えてみたこともないんですけども、
何かがかましてあるんですか？
そうです。2枚をかましておるんです。それでもつけてはおりませんけども、これ外れるんです。2枚がすぐこうスッと外れてしまうんですけれども、はい、どこからこの発想が来たのか分かりませんけれども、神様が突然与えてくれたようなもんですね。これ最初作った時は、写真にも載っておりますけど、もうちょっと角度が急だったんですね。でもやはり見てて、ちょっとその角度が急なので安定感が欠けるなと。でこの角度の方が安定感が保てるというようなことでもってこの角度に作り変えました。
Right. So he alludes to the fact this is not the first iteration of this composition, and in fact that is, he shows us in another photo album that was the first try, very different from what we see now. I think if you Google that image now, we often find this, which doesn't seem to me to be the same tree. It's certainly not the same rocks, but whether he has replanted it, recreated it, I don't know. I wasn't able to establish that. But it certainly doesn't tell us, well, it tells the same story. But anyway, there you go. Mr. Kimura's forest or mountain or thing. Now, this is the typical tree that he works on, typical kind of Japanese pine tree. And it's the type of thing that he uses to train his apprentices. One thing I found interesting was that one of these apprentices, a Mr. Ryan Neal, has now just recently gone off on a bit of a tangent, and he's come up with this. So the question we need to ask is this a deconstruction? In other words, is he breaking down the stereotypical pine tree into its elements, base elements? Is this a new style? Or is Ryan Neal being plain lazy? What do you guys think?
If I can, I'm going to jump in and say, it looks to me like it's the start of something, but it certainly doesn't look like a finished idea yet. I mean, I can see how he's taken the photograph, he's put it in nature so that you can, you know, he's echoing the feel of its surroundings, but it definitely doesn't look to me like a project that is at its outcome, at its final destination.
Well, he's actually taken this tree, pot and all, and gone and sat in the mountains and worked on it there and kind of, you know, returning his bonsai back to basics. It's actually quite fascinating. But let's hear what he has to say.
Can I say something as well? Because
yes.
To me, it feels that he's trying to find...
Sorry, Vicky, carry on.
No, to me, it feels that he's trying to find his roots, a connection between what he's learned in the East and bring it to what he's seeing in the mountains, to what he's seeing in his own environment, to try and create that identity of a North American bonsai, which he's searching for desperately. Yeah. So that is what I see when I see that tree.
Yeah. I've actually noticed that there's this kind of need or desire everywhere around the world to find the tree that represents us, you know, the Americans are doing it, the Australians are doing it, we are doing it, Europeans do it. So there are pockets of different styles, perhaps different, but certainly different expressions in the art. So as a broad art, I think this is expanding, and that may be a good thing. Okay, but let's listen
But
to
you've
what
alluded to it already.
Yeah,
You've said to us how we actually get influenced by what's around us.
that's right. So this takes that one step further. So let's listen to what he says.
The purest intention of bonsai is to recreate nature in miniature. And inside of the practice of bonsai, you start to recognize that this microcosm connects you to the natural environment. It embodies this grand environment. The tree is the great storyteller. It tells us things about the land that we cannot deduce ourselves. Mineral content, moisture levels, direction of the wind, the angle of the sun. The tree bridges the land to human and informs us about the environment in which we exist. Across the world, these great communicators that help us understand the land upon which we stand are disappearing in a mass extinction and a loss of flora. And it feels pertinent to embed myself in the environment, to understand these elements, to try to process them in the way that the tree does, and to see what the outcome of that is that comes from this work.
Right. For those of you who didn't go to the Saba convention, here's a little snippet of a presentation Carl did based on the bristlecone pine, which is something that we're not intimately familiar with, but I'm going to call it a phenomenon because it's really an interaction between the tree and its surroundings. So Carl said about restyling a tree.
Many years ago, probably about 10 or 15 years ago, I was on a camp with some friends, and we went up a granite mountain, and we came across this granite slab. And what was so nice about it was so incredibly thin. I mean, it really is a dramatically thin slab. So thin that I was quite worried about it actually keeping its integrity. So I actually did put a fiberglass base underneath it, so it is supported on fiberglass. So I've had the slab for many years and needed to find something to put onto a slab. And what I was wanting to do was trying to actually think about the kinds of landscapes that one actually has, little granite-based landscapes where you actually would have a lot of exposed granite, a mountaintop or something like that. So just trying to get some inspiration and some ideas on the landscape that we can develop and we can use. And the idea that I got was the landscapes around bristlecone pine trees, because it's a very interesting landscape, very harsh landscape, and the trees are particularly interesting. So bristlecone pine, interestingly enough, bristlecone pine is actually 3 different species. I didn't really realize that, but depending on the different regions of the United States where they grow. And the key thing about them is that they are tree-line species. So they are right up at the edge of where trees can actually survive on the high mountains in California and the western parts of the States. This is the kind of landscape that they occur in. This is another example of the landscape. So it's really very, very barren, very rocky, granite-based, and then you've got your lone trees that are growing in that environment. So also, when you're looking at these pictures, start looking at the designs and the characteristics that these trees actually have. It's also important to see that, generally you have it in the sort of rocky pavement area, but you do actually get bristlecone pines that grow in areas with larger boulders and larger granite rocks. And I think the thing that I found most amazing was it takes them 700 years before the trunk stops being round. So the trunk diameter is about 40 centimeters, and that's a 700-year-old tree, and it's still round. It isn't really classed as an old tree yet. So what this is really cross-sectional, basically an analysis of the cross-section of the different bristlecone pines, dealing with the age as you go along down to the bottom. So the youngest tree at the top and the oldest trees are at the bottom. So if we just zoom in a little bit, you can see there the way in which, this is a 140-year-old tree up to 580, 720 years. Only at 720 years is it actually beginning to get some deadwood on it, and the bark is getting damaged, and the tree is beginning to change. And then what's interesting with these trees is that the wood is incredibly resilient and tough, so the wood doesn't ever rot. And so what happens is, during a couple of centuries, if the conditions aren't great for the tree, sections will die off, but it's able to actually have these live veins and single branches that survive. And then, when you move into a couple more centuries where it's a bit warmer or better conditions, they then start growing and the trunk then develops. And that's the reason why you get these kind of shapes that develop. So this dark line here is the living section on the tree. So you can see here's a 1,800-year-old tree. The dot there is the center where the tree started growing, and now it's just that section that's alive. And so it's developing these kind of plates of deadwood as the tree develops. Looking at the deadwood a little bit closer and the interaction of the live and dead, you can see that it's really, very expressive, very characterful. They're really incredibly beautiful trees, very gnarled. So again, this is the kind of landscape that I'm drawing the inspiration from, trying to develop some kind of image with this granite slab that actually would be looking like that. And again, you can start seeing the kinds of designs that are used. They're often quite funny branch angles. There's lots of movement or twisting and movement on the trunk. And the branches are quite stubby and quite randomly arranged and quite kind of chaotic.
Right, so Carl then sets about frantically remodeling the tree. And it wasn't long that he calmed down. All the activity slowed, and this was the result. So how's that for a representation of a tree in nature, or a bristlecone pine? Pretty impressive, I think.
Brilliant.
Yeah, really amazing.
It is. Right, so let's have a look at another fella and a tree that inspired him.
What's up, everyone? Well, today I thought I'd share a little bit of the backstory of this valley oak that I started from an acorn back in 2005. When I was a beginner in bonsai, I really came at bonsai from the angle of capturing the essence of trees that I had enjoyed as a child growing up in rural Northern California. And valley oaks were one of the trees that I really felt were iconic. I really felt that valley oaks represented my childhood. And so the first batch of trees that I started from seed were valley oaks. And I picked the acorns off of a tree in the Sacramento area, Roseville specifically. And it was a very large, very stately old tree that was the centerpiece of a park in the city of Roseville. Let's just talk about a little bit about the design of the tree. When I look at valley oaks in nature, what I see is sort of a water fountain shape, and as opposed to the standard bonsai kind of pine shape where you have a trunk and the first branch, second branch, back branch kind of structure. With oak trees, it's really and a lot of deciduous trees or even broadleaf evergreens, the structure can be very different. And that's really what I've been going for ever since I started these guys, as with the intention of creating sort of a replica of the California wild in miniature.
All right.
I've always encouraged people to study the source material, study trees in nature. Nature is the inspiration for bonsai, and then bonsai is your interpretation of nature. So it becomes a personal piece of art. Today, we're going to go out into the bog, a real bog, and study trees and the plant life in a bog to inspire us to further develop this bog planting. In the last video of this mixed bog type forest, I created some deer trails going through the bush, and today we're going to see some real life examples of that. I have arrived here in the bog, so let's have a look around and see some of the details that make up a bog forest. One of the cool features of a bog forest is all the beautiful understory plants, mosses, lichens, ferns, all kinds of really cool plants. In a previous video on my bog forest, I said I wanted the forest to look uninviting. So here's an example of that. You can see that, you know, there's no real way to walk into this forest. All the dead branches go right down to the ground. There's no pathways. It's just uninviting. And that's kind of a cool look. Another feature of the bogs is this dark black soil. So when you get water, standing water like this, it just looks black and dark. It's pretty cool. Here's a really nice deer trail here. It's nice and green. Just beautiful in here. Black spruce all around me. This is what inspires me to do that bog forest planting. Just scenes like this, they're just so beautiful. You see all kinds of cool ideas that you can apply to your miniature bonsai forest. So this forest is a miniature interpretation of the walk that I did today. I have my sections of the forest where no one's invited, where you couldn't really walk through there, it's too dense. I have my deer trails, I have my spruce trees, and I have my larch, and a few dead trees too. Sure reminds me of walking in the bog forest today.
Now, I think apart from the hairstyle, Nigel Saunders actually, he certainly captures nature. Whether we call it bonsai or not, is a personal interpretation, I think, but I suppose anything is art and art is anything. But certainly, coming back to our theme, really, the core of this whole thing is that his forest tells a story and it speaks quite loudly. Now, compare this is another one of his forests, which is modeled after the Avatar Grove in Colombia, in Canada. The focus there is obviously very much on a single tree, where by comparison to Kimura's forest, there is no overriding emphasis on a single tree. It's more a collective. One can almost argue that the focus is actually on the mountain. It's on elements that you can't see. So two styles of forests, but the elements are all the same. The expression different. One thing, if you notice, that's true in both, coincidental or not, I'm not sure. But if you have a look at Kimura's forest, there's that little gap between the two slopes, and that, I believe, is quite intentional. Nigel Saunders' tree, if I can get my pointer to come to your screen. I'm not sure if you can see it, but there's a gap there as well. So similar technique. And this is not something that's spoken about in the bonsai world. Nobody will tell you that there is an element of depth which is expressed by a vanishing point. And that's exactly what that is. That spot there is a vanishing point. And everything kind of leads you there. You've got these angles in the slope, angles in the trees that lead you to that vanishing point and transfers you out the back. If you have a look at a couple of images in nature, they do the same thing. We have this expansive trees, but there's a spot of light at the back that draws our attention into and through the forest. The same thing happens with paths, streams, and little valleys. Now this is something I learned not from in the bonsai world. My mother was a landscape artist or landscape painter, and this is something that she taught me, that when a path needs to narrow as it goes to the back to instill this sense of depth, the sense of perspective, but it also needs to go somewhere, and it needs to reach that vanishing point. It needs to transfer you from the foreground to the background and give you a journey along the way. These are actually very easy techniques or characteristics which we can add to our plantings, add to our bonsai with no effort. See, here's another interesting photograph of a forest with no real vanishing point. But the photographer in this case has cleverly used a puff of smoke in the middle there as a substitute. That puff of smoke is giving us the same effect as drawing our attention and driving us through this forest to some destination. I actually looked then for dark, gloomy, foreboding forests to see if I could, if this holds true. And lo and behold, the darkest, gloomiest ones I could find have a light at the end of the tunnel. And if this is not the case, if we have a dark background in a forest, what it does is it foreshortens the whole thing. What we see is a flattening of the image. So we lose that sense of perspective, we lose the depth, we lose half the story. And that ultimately is what we're trying to convey. There's another image, kind of very Blair Witch type of thing. But the intention in that movie in particular, where they used this imagery, was to create confusion, to flatten the image, to create confusion. There's no depth, no direction. Everything is just a mess. So it's actually a very clever, I don't want to call it a trick, but it's a technique that we can apply to our plantings in particular. So let's have a look at the construction then of a typical forest, typical multi-tree planting. We obviously have our vanishing point at the end of our little valley, but we also have these leading lines that draw our attention toward it. It leads us and gives us this sense of depth. Now, incidentally, this I've never come across, I've never heard it spoken of in any bonsai circle, but I did see it, I did hear about it in the land of aquascaping. Same techniques, big trees in front, small at the back, vanishing spot, little paths. But that's an entirely different story. We're not getting into aquascaping right now. Let's have a look at another bonsai forest. We can add our leading lines along the landscape, and it takes us to, it isolates one of those two gaps at the back. And lo and behold, we have our vanishing point. Very simple technique. here's a planting, another forest that is very typical of the way we get taught to do forests. You know, you grab handfuls of seedlings, as many as you can possibly shove into a tray, and voila, you have yourself a forest. But if we try and apply those principles we just looked at, in this case, there are no leading lines, not that we can see at this stage anyway. And what would appear to be a vanishing point kind of leads you over the edge and out the side of the pot. It does not add depth to this particular planting. Right, so here's a look at some very old olive trees. Now this guy is not very talkative, but I think the trees speak for themselves. They are roughly between 2,000 and 3,000 years old, these trees. And if you know, talk about bark on a tree, these things are way beyond bark. In fact, there's one person with us tonight who I think has one of these in her memory bank as a reference tree. Hey, Vicky?
More than one. Yeah, they're beautiful.
Well, that's just insane.
Just have a look at those branches, though. You know, we can get a snippet of it. There's a lot of talk about having young branches in old trees, but this is exactly what we're seeing here. But that's actually a deliberate kind of farming technique. What they do to revive these old trees is they chop the branches off. The tree then sends out new branches, new young branches that bear fruit all over again. So it breathes a new sort of life into it.
I was going to say that they still produce fruit and they still fund. Yeah.
There you can see that transition between old and new quite clearly. Maybe there's hope for our trees that have youngish looking branches. They're not a lost cause. These are obviously a little younger. It would make a spectacular bonsai, I think. You know, there's similar trees in Israel, in the Garden of Gethsemane for one, which are aged well over 2,000 years old. And they incidentally, have a look at that bottom tree. They embarked on this campaign to find a national tree. And this I think was it. This was the chosen tree. But just have a look at the roots and the nabari on that tree. I mean, you don't see that on olives normally. This is spectacular. Right. So here's another thing I've noticed in recent years. There's this attempt to kind of replicate things which perhaps are unfeasible. These trees that grow along walls like this are almost always ficus. And when people try and reproduce them, they create things which I don't believe have much of a longevity. And ficus are not kind on constructions, and they'll break that little brick wall apart in next to no time. And then you actually have a failed experiment or failed tree, which is quite sad. The same thing goes for rock plantings in a way. The one downfall here, of course, is that the rock stays the same size while the tree grows. And if the tree outgrows the rock, well, then it's simply going to either swallow it, or it's going to push the whole thing, the proportion out of whack, and kind of destroy the story. Trees are quite capable of splitting rocks in half or in multiple pieces. And I mean, that might be part of the story. But, you know, certainly these things are stronger than we give them credit for. Now, when we get it right, the balance between tree and rock, the images are quite spectacular. That would be quite a brilliant feat if we could reproduce that in a pot. These things hark a little back to our bristlecone pine, but different medium, different expression, but yet the same feeling. Now, if you've ever you know, kind of browsed the internet for pictures of trees, you may have come across this thing. And if you've ever wondered how you're going to translate that into a pot, into a bonsai, well, I certainly did. Maybe I'm the only one, but there is a solution. How about this? 2 pots. Anyway, the ultimate inspiration, I guess, comes from Yamadori. We can't hide that fact. I mean, this fuels our passion second to none. And so let's have a look at it.
Saulófá gur dihilach an áite carandracha agus crege imaliske de chraun fás. Ach tan a cín seo in an puil bioga cré aimsú in mask na scultina. Áite mecha nohan cohu unto chun marach dáil.
So what's this little thing, Cormac?
Believe it or not, that's a tree. That's a willow tree.
This little thing?
That's a willow tree, and I wouldn't even hazard a guess as to how old.
What, it's 2 or 3 years old?
It could be 30, 40 years old.
No. Yes, but the branch does look rather wizened, yeah.
Yeah, it's nature's bonsai. It's trying to eke out an existence in a little crevice in the rock where there's no nutrient, or very little nutrient, and its roots are completely confined. So it's struggling away there, but
yeah.
And you find it in nature, particularly in rocky places, and they're scattered around the lake shore there, and even the other side of the shore there, you can see. I see a lovely Scots pine, what I would call
that one there.
Yeah, the one with the little umbrella.
That's just a baby.
Shape. That's very, very old, and I would almost say that shows up in very old photographs. That's 100 years plus.
No.
Easily.
That little thing.
That little one there. And again, it's trying to eke out an existence in a rocky patch.
Yeah, the things that drive us. But how about this? This is a tree in an art museum in Tokyo. Straight as a ramrod. No first branch, second branch, no nothing. And the top is, you know, totally bristling with energy. Breaks every rule in the convention, and yet it's quite spectacular. But it must have some inspiration. Something must have driven this, and I guess it did. Someone took a walk up the mountain and saw that and said, "I like it," and he did. He created a bonsai like it. And back to Mr. Naka, yeah, he does too. He breaks convention more often than we give him credit for. This is one of his suggestions. So ultimately, conventions and rules, so-called rules, are guidelines. They get us started, but they're not the be and end all.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. I want to speak about this Carpinus today. It's an oriental hornbeam, Carpinus orientalis, and it's living in southeastern Europe, and that's where it was collected 10 years ago in Croatia by a friend of mine, and I got it about 10 years ago. And now it's sort of finished in a way, but bonsai is never finished, but it's good enough, for example, to be on a show. Now if you look at this, you may say, wow, this is a very nice tree. It doesn't look like a bonsai. I say, thank you very much. That's exactly what I want. I want people to think that this tree is growing in the mountain. Nobody has ever touched it other than nature, and that's my aim. However, with all sort of artificial means, that's how I accomplish that. So you first of all have to find a material like that, and it does grow in Croatia, but I bet it grows where you are. You're not going to tell me that they're not around. I know everywhere in the world you find trees for that. But of course, you don't find it like that. You just find a stump with a few branches. And then you have to make a decision of where the future is. In this case, you have these two, some people may call it two branches, which the tree is splitting into. Now this is not branches, this is two trunks. So my vision was to have what is called the informal broom form. What's that? Well, I've invented that. So I can explain it to you. The formal broom form, you know, that's in the books. The informal broom form is what? Is a tree that looks like a normal broadleaf tree in nature. So it's not in the books. It should be in the books because that's the most normal tree form. And that's what I saw. So these are not branches but trunks. And then and from these trunks come the branches, and these branches split into smaller branches. After a while you get it nice and ramified, but not just by itself. Now there's a few things that you may not like. For example, some people don't like these warts. You see that? So I say, yeah, I understand why you don't like it, but if you don't like it, take another tree. It's not that I would never take these away. This is part of the nature of that tree, and that's what it looks like. By the way, do you see that it looks pretty cool from all sides? There's a lot of discussion about choosing the front. When you have such a tree, you don't choose the front, you make it look good from all sides. And in the very end, somebody can decide which is the best front. I still not so sure. I really like this one, and I also like this one. It looks pretty cool. But you may like another one. And so why? Because a real normal tree out in nature does not have a front. And you can walk around it and take photographs, and in the end you will find a few of these photographs look better than the others. So that's how I approach this. The other thing is that I try very hard to avoid things which make this look like a bonsai. It's in the so-called naturalistic style. So what does naturalistic mean? It means that the tree should look like nature did it, like no man did it. And where does this come from? This comes from a saying of John Naka, who said about 40 years ago, don't try to make your little tree look like a bonsai. Try to make your bonsai look like a tree. It's that simple. Okay. If you take these words, don't try to make your little tree look like a bonsai. You only have to know what does it make look like a bonsai. If it wants to look like a bonsai, it has to be a triangle. It has to have a first branch on 1/3. It has to have several other branches. It can have some curve, be the informal upright. And then you have the pads where the bird can fly through, and you have more or less horizontal branches. And this you can do, okay? But then you have something that looks like a bonsai, which is fine. Most people do it. I'm also guilty of that. Go to the exhibit, you'll find a lot of broadleaf, or call them deciduous trees, which do look like a bonsai, do look like a juniper that wants to look like a pine tree, because a real standard bonsai is a pine tree in the end. Okay, so try to avoid everything that looks like a pine, and you have a natural tree. Anyway, I can only suggest to you, look at nature, look at what nature does, and don't necessarily look at bonsai books for an image how you want to style your tree. And then just find your material. You will find it. I tell you, you will find it.
I think he's certainly taken us all on a different journey, Mr. Walter Paul, with his naturalistic trees. And these are some of the images that he alluded to, trees that perhaps aren't all that naturalistic and do look like bonsai. But anyway, he's certainly influencing us in a big way at the moment, I think. There's another tree where this is a sycamore tree on Hadrian's Wall, called the Gap sycamore, and it is featured in movies like Robin Hood and Harry Potter, and also a number of bonsai artists like Walter Paul, Graham Potter, and Ian Young have referred to it specifically in the past, because it kind of typifies the European tree, I think, which is a little taller and more upright than the Japanese expression, perhaps. The Japanese tree, typically the broom style tree, is more pom-pom like, more kind of candy floss. And translate that to a bonsai, it becomes just a big ball. So much for seeing the trunk and the birds flying through it. Come to African trees, and we have a totally different expression. And certainly, not only Africa, but I think, certainly true for every big sky country, where you have these massive, expansive trees. Now, if you have a look in the back, there are the pom-pom trees, there are the candy floss types, but they don't speak Africa. They don't speak big sky. This is an expression. I don't want to call it a style, because ultimately I think it's still just a broom style. It's just a different expression of it. But it's fascinating how this style that we actually grow up with hasn't found its expression in a big way. Now, Leon and I both own little marula trees. In fact, mine is just barely crawled out of a pip three years ago. But anyway, it's got a long way before it reaches this stage. But again, a big sky tree. And these things, African trees, big sky trees, dominate the landscape. Absolutely dominate. They're spectacular. There's another tree form that many of us are familiar with, and that's the desert trees. And for those of you who like moss under your trees and exhibition, guess what's on its way to you? As soon as I find a decent candidate, you're getting a tree like this. And there's one for Gavin. There's one for Gavin, the little man underneath it. So, Vicky, I think you wanted to say something?
No, it was me, Deric, saying, yes, please, you can go ahead and send us that tree. Thanks very much.
Yeah, shake the entire exhibition world. Anyway, what's this?
In the Sahara Desert,
can you hear that?
There stands a strange marking the place where once the most isolated tree in the world stood. The Tenere wastelands were once populated by a rich forest of acacia trees. By the 20th century, all but one had been wiped out. The story of the last tree of Tenere is short, sad, and stupid. This tree had roots that ran 40 feet deep and was surrounded on all sides by 400 kilometers of nothing but sand. When a British officer came upon it in 1939, he exclaimed, "You have to see this tree to believe it." He didn't understand why camels hadn't come and eaten its leaves, why the locals hadn't chopped it down and used it for firewood. He said this tree was a kind of miracle and must also be sacred to the people who lived there, and it was. It marked a place on caravan routes and was treated as a sacred symbol of life in the desert, but it didn't stand the rest of the 20th century quite as well. And in 1973, a drunk Libyan truck driver ran headfirst into the tree, despite having 400 kilometers on either side to go around it. Nonetheless, into the tree he went, broke it clean off, and in that instant, the last tree of Tenerife was no more. Once called the most remote tree in the world, it still managed to be hit by a drunk driver. So, in its place, today, there is a kind of weird metal fake tree used to mark the spot and honor its existence. But it is a poor replacement for this tiny, beautiful sliver of life that once flourished in the otherwise empty desert. Subscribe here and watch more videos here. Can you freaking imagine driving across the desert and hitting literally the only thing you could hit?
All right. I think that speaks for itself. All right. So what do we think of baobabs? Probably the most iconic African tree, second to acacias, maybe even outstripping the acacia. Now that little central group there, I think would make a brilliant forest, except I would hate to pick it up. I'd hate to own the thing because you'd never get anywhere. That as a forest, as a group would be monstrous, but impressive. Right, so when Mr. Pierneef comes along, he sees these baobabs and they inspire him to paint them. And so he does. We come along and we see these trees and we try and emulate them. And some people have been, well, let's call it reasonably successful. Although I think, you know, this is a very difficult tree to emulate. It's just the scale is absolutely something beyond. That is a guy, Lampi Skuman, who owns, by some accounts, he owns 200 or more of these things. Certainly, and I won't call it an obsession, but definitely a passion. Right, so Pierneef also came along and saw the acacias and painted those. He saw a different type of acacia and painted them. So in fact, there's more than one expression of a Pierneef acacia tree. We have been exposed to this one of a Louis Nell, which is not an acacia, by the way. It's actually a buddleia, but it's grown in that style. Then Gavin grew one which I think represents the African acacia pretty well. But of course, the tree doesn't look much like that anymore. It's been altered somewhat. You know, as a kid, I grew up spending a lot of time in the back of a bakkie, driving down national roads with nothing more to do than to stare at trees going by. And of course, they fascinated me, and I began to love them. And you know, certainly, especially the ones that we managed to stop under to have a bite to eat, they kind of stood out. And then I discovered Google Maps, and I can now go back and revisit those trees. It's a very, very fascinating bit of an experience. There's one tree called the Leerboom, which stands on the national road between Messina and Uitrichard. It was actually smack bang in the middle of where they wanted to build the road. But it was such a big effort to move it that they decided to put this kink in the road and go around it. So there's this kink in the national road to get itself around the Leerboom. But as with the tree of Tenere, this poor thing has also been struck by a few drunk drivers who've absolutely ruined this left-hand side of it. I think those branches don't exist anymore. This photograph is pretty old. Some other trees that we sometimes take for granted are city trees. Yeah, until they come into bloom, and then suddenly we look up and we kind of take notice. But we grow up with trees right around us, like Walter Paul tells us, these things exist. We just need to look. And right in the company gardens, we've got some very big African big sky trees. Good examples. All around the city, there are trees that could form the basis of great inspiration, great expression of new styles, new avenues we can pursue, perhaps even develop something uniquely Cape Townian. But there's another form of inspiration, not directly nature-based. I remember a grade 2 teacher once read to us from a book called The Faraway Tree. And this picture almost embodies the tree that she painted. She painted the tree, the picture with words, and that developed into this image. It's still stuck in my head today. When I think of a kind of big fictitious tree, this is where I go. That faraway tree with all its little animals that live inside the trunk and along the branches and things. It's fascinating. And then, of course, we all know that Pooh Bear lives in a tree in Noordhoek.
Far away, in the heart of Africa, a young country falcon leaves the nest for the big city. Soon, the feathers will hit the fan. Didn't know we were hunting giraffes now.
All right. Inspiration from movies. One artist inspires another, and I guess this is something we reach back to. We reach to each other and we learn from each other, sometimes not even in the same discipline, but the inspiration transfers. Another movie, of course, was Avatar, which some people have tried to emulate. They've tried to grow bonsai trees that look like those collateral trees, not with great success, I can tell you. But anyway, it inspired a few people. Right, so let's go back now to our tree. It's I've called this thing combining elements, but it's actually, we're going to now look at pulling those elements apart. If you've read the articles I wrote in the newsletters in this past while, you will be familiar with what I'm about to do now. We're going to spin a couple of spirals around this tree to see what we can learn. And have a look at that line. This tree absolutely dominates that space. First of all, if we spin it from this side, everything, including the rock on the left, is encapsulated by that spiral. And I guess that's where many of the streams and the storms were kind of originated from. But if you have a look at the origin of that spiral, it kind of starts in nowhere, in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing significant there. If we spin it the other way around, again, the origin is nowhere, but it now grabs a hold of this empty space on the right, the negative space. You often hear people talk about negative space. That's part of this picture. And if I was to imagine a calm, placid lake, it would be in that space. in front of the tree and down towards the right. So it's no surprise then that this tree kind of speaks many languages. But if we take those two points and we average them, what we have is a virtual trunk. The focal point now is on a virtual trunk, which doesn't actually exist, but it's smack bang between the top and the bottom. And taking our experience a little bit another step, follow the leading lines, it takes us to that blank space, which you spoke about earlier, our vanishing point. So this tree has, well, I'm going to say not deliberately, but certainly by design, has all the elements which makes this a very fascinating composition. It's no wonder that it kind of took us on so many journeys and told us so many stories. Now hold that thought, because I've just set you up for another experience, another analysis. Just have a look at this. This is an image that popped up on the internet a little while ago, and I think contains kind of great elements, but somehow doesn't quite manage to tell the story. And I think this is why. Do our spirals again. It starts in nothing, and then we have this the tree on the right that escapes it, kind of runs away. It's not part of the story. Spin the spiral the other way around. Now everything tries to escape, and we still don't have anything interesting at its origin. So the question now is, do we have a bonsai or do we have a diorama? There's certainly nothing wrong, I think, with what they try to achieve, but it's just as if great ideas, great components, but they're all pointing in different directions. So getting them to tell a single story is, well, let's call it, that's an art, and needs to be pursued. Now here's a tree which I photographed on the show, which you're going to do the same thing to. And you'll see above it, there's a little bright spot which you can ignore. It's not the Bethlehem star, nor is it the tooth fairy. It's actually a light in the roof there. So just ignore that part. Anyway, we put the spiral on, and it's fitting pretty well. Oh, okay, wrong arrow. Go the other way. And now we've, and I've done both, left and right, because this is kind of a symmetrical tree. There's no bias, no immediate bias one way or the other. But what we've got is a focal point right smack bang in the middle of the canopy, which is brilliant. It's I can almost guarantee that, and I'm not even sure whose tree this is, by the way. I've forgotten. People that worked on the tree didn't have these spirals in mind. And if we were now to apply our magic vanishing point, where would you think that would go? I'd suggest right there, which emphasizes to me the importance of negative space. Come back to the negative space thing. It has value. It's part of the story. But we all hear that it's so important, but never a why, never a how. But here we go. Now all these things are perhaps not all that important, but they're interesting and they're useful. They're useful little tools. But this whole exercise actually does nothing other than emphasize that we should trust our instinct. This image that we've built up in our mind, the tree in our brain, maybe many, serve us well. It's a reference library which is probably more reliable than most other things. So ultimately, if a tree tells a story, then it's a good bonsai. If a tree manages to relate its environment, its its struggles and the whole context of where it comes from, then I think we've succeeded. We've achieved something. All right, folks, that's me. That's my presentation done. I trust you enjoyed it.